I will just let people in as they hop in. So.
Okay, great.
Cool.
Well, thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to share with you what I have been doing in my classroom for probably the last 7 years, is using OpenStreetMapping in my classroom. And this is kind of things I I have a lot of information, so I'm going to try to cover it as much as I can, and I probably won't cover everything, but at least you'll have the PowerPoint that if you wanted to go back and check out links and things like that. So I'm going to address these sort of things as we go through. So I came across OpenStreetMapping when I attended the American Geographical Society conference. They have a teacher fellowship program, and I got to go, and it was a really a great experience because I got to learn about OpenStreetMap. And just kind of give you some background, this is my third career, so I worked for the federal government. And so I worked for USAID and I worked for USDA. And so when I saw what OpenStreetMapping could do, I had this aha moment of, I got to get this to my students. I got to teach my students they can do this. We got to have a training, and we're the TeachOSM team that I'm now a part of, was training about 50 teachers and teaching us about how to use OpenStreetMapping and getting us comfortable with it so that eventually we could use it in our classrooms. This is a video. I'm not going to show it, but you could go back. It's talking about, it's called the Map Give, and this is basically coming from the State Department talking about how OpenStreetMapping is used, which I'm going to go cover, and how they're looking for volunteer mappers. And this is a great activity for high school students. I wouldn't recommend it for middle school students, just to kind of put that in there. But it's great for high school students if you're looking for something to get them engaged. One of the things I'll say about it is that this is thinking about, a lot of times when we think of maps and we think of geography, we're consuming maps, especially when we're teaching history classes or we're looking at data. We're always consuming that map, but this is actually making a map. And I think that that's really important when you think about OpenStreetMapping. It's participatory mapping. It's and this is a new field that's been coming about in the last probably 15 years. And there's different kinds of participatory mapping, but OpenStreetMapping is one of those. And so when we kind of think about how, what's going on, you have all these people that are collaborating together and they're creating maps. And these are just kind of some of the organizations. Some of you might hear from Missing Maps, OpenStreetMap, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap. And there's a lot of organizations that are out there working together, and they all talk to one another. So it's a very big community, and they're collaborating and mapping these areas, and we're going to talk about why they need to be mapped. And so when you think about it, you think about, what is the value of this labor? That's kind of, why am I doing this? What's going on here? Why is this data important? And how does this kind of contribute to society? How does this contribute to communities? And it's kind of just all these people from all over the world are collaborating to making maps. And so some people will say, well, we have Google Maps, right? A lot of people pick up their cell phones, right? And they say, I have maps like right here. Yes, that's true. But the difference between Google Maps versus OpenStreetMap is OpenStreetMap is open source data, and Google Maps, that is private information. So if you wanted to use Google Maps data to make a map, you would have to pay them for it. And that's sort of how OpenStreetMap came about. The gentleman that created it went to Google Maps saying, I want to create a map that shows this. And they said, well, you have to pay us for our data. And he says, well, why should I have to pay for something when it's right in front of me? I could collect the data. And so he didn't think it was going to take off, but it did. One of the stories is in 2006, it kind of really became kind of like, hey, this is kind of necessary. We could get people to map areas in Haiti during the earthquake. And so that it kind of helped people, it helped resources like Red Cross, when's the last map, when was Haiti last mapped? And how many people were impacted, and where do we need to send our resources? So what it is basically is you get satellite images, of an area. And those satellite images are put in by different companies that OpenStreetMap allows them to put those images in. And you zoom in and you can draw a line where there's a building. You can draw a line where there's a road. And so you can start looking at satellite images and giving it an attribute. So as you can see on here, this is a person that's looking at a satellite image. They say, okay, this looks like a building to me. So I'm going to draw an area and I'm going to label it as a building. And this is important because this is a way of how we're making the map. The next one is kind of showing you a bigger picture of where you can see all the different buildings as well as the roads and things like that that you can map in there. And so some people say, you know, I like to say OpenStreetMapping is like this new geography. You know, it helps you think about space, place, and location and navigation. It's letting students kind of think about academic and career options when they're thinking about it, because people are using this. There's organizations that use this, and I'll talk more about that. It's also introducing them to this global community throughout the entire world that are using it. And they can contribute to those communities sitting from their computer. And so this is kind of something, and the other thing is, this is where I'm going to emphasize, is that they can provide service to a community or to their own community sitting from their computer, which I think was something that comes about, especially with the time of COVID. And so some people say, well, why would I want to make a map? And a lot of people don't think about those kinds of things, but one of the things a lot of people don't realize is there's a lot of places in this world that are not mapped. And when you think about that, if they're not mapped, they're very vulnerable. They're missing people. So that's kind of one of the things you have to think about. And if they're missing, they're not being part of those decision-making processes, whether it's governments, whether it's NGOs, whether it's, you know, do we need to get resources, food and resources to those people? If you don't know that there's 250,000 people there living there, you're not going to take an account to service those people or provide them with services if you don't know that they're there. So this makes them very vulnerable. And so if, for example, if a disaster happens and you don't know that there's 250,000 people living there, you're not going to know that you need to get resources for 250,000 people. You're going to just say, there's no one there. And then you show up and you're like, oh my goodness, we've got a lot of people with a lot of needs. And so this is kind of one of the things that you kind of have to think about. And you know, so I always like to say OpenStreetMapping comes in kind of as the rescue, you know, it's a kind of way where we can start tackling where these areas are, where people aren't mapped, and help them and help their communities so that they have the data so that they can build better and stronger communities. And so we call this participatory mapping. And I think it's pretty remarkable. And so I'm going to show you some examples. This is an example in Hot where we had so many Syrian refugees that were fleeing and they were going into refugee camps. And as these refugee camps are, you know, you're talking to students, these refugee camps are growing sometimes by the thousands per day. And it's really important to kind of really think about that. Like if it's growing by 1,000 a day, and you have to have all these, you know, health resources or food resources or any type of service that the refugees would need to find in a refugee camp, how do they navigate? How do they navigate in that as it's growing on a daily basis? So what it looked like on Monday is going to look completely different than it did, you know, on Saturday, because so many people are coming in. And so this is a project where the refugees started mapping the refugee camp. And it's a really interesting article. You know, another, you know, when we talk about vulnerable people, we talk about informal settlements. You know, these are, you know, some people call them squatter settlements, places where the government is not, the government isn't there. People just start building homes. What does that look like? And they're not taken into consideration. And so if you look on the bottom, you can kind of see this is Google, and they kind of have like some, you know, places to eat, but you don't have any concept of how many people are living there or how many buildings are living there. And then if you look at the OpenStreetMapping, you start to kind of get a better idea of how many buildings are there, how many people are living there, how dense is this space. Another example is internally displaced people in Yemen. We know that as many people are fleeing, 24 million people are in need of resources, and they need 80% are needing some type of humanitarian assistance. And as people move, and I always talk to my students, when people move and a large amount of people are moving at the same time, this is not a good thing. It's not good. It puts a strain on resources like food, healthcare, water, clean water, and then that creates an environment that can lead to a lot of disease, breakouts of different kinds of diseases, and it makes these people very vulnerable. And so you can go in, and this is kind of showing you where this is people have migrated to this new area. It's kind of in real time. This was a project saying, okay, we need this place mapped. These refugees have settled in this land. And so you can kind of see Google is only going to update when Google gets there. And Google's not going to get there in real time. However, OpenStreetMap can do this a lot faster and a lot quicker through volunteer mappers. And they can show, okay, maybe there wasn't a lot of people there a year ago, but today we've got a significant amount of people that we need to make sure that they're getting resources so that they can continue to survive. Here's another example of in Iraq, an earthquake happened, and this is kind of when you think about, this earthquake happened. They don't have electricity. People don't, the hospitals are in destruction. They don't have medical care. And so the question is what happened? How many people have been impacted? How much resources? Where do we need to go? And where do we need to send our resources and teams to help people to get them back into a standard of living that's healthy? And so this is kind of, you can go in and you can find what's going on in the world, and you can find these mapping projects that are going to show students, and they can help people in real time, which I think is pretty remarkable. And so people say, well, who's using OpenStreetMap? And, it's very funny. My husband, that's why we were in Vermont. My husband loves to mountain bike. And so he uses Strava a lot, right? And he doesn't really understand, he's like, okay, OpenStreetMap. My wife likes OpenStreetMap. She gets really excited. I'm like, look, so-and-so uses OpenStreetMap data. I'm so excited. And so, finally I found out, I'm like, hey, hon, I just letting you know your Strava account that you're constantly obsessed over while you're doing your mountain biking. And that uses OpenStreetMap data. So it's volunteer mappers that are mapping those areas so that you can keep track of how much you're writing, But, I always say to my students, have you ordered anything from Amazon lately? Have you ever used Uber? Have you been using, Microsoft or anything, your Apple products, Facebook, and trying to show the diversity of different organizations that are using OpenStreetMap data. I used to say too, but you can't say it because a lot of people haven't been flying lately, but if you are flying and they're showing you the map of where your plane is, if you see on the bottom corner, it used to say, OpenStreetMap data. I mean, that's where they were getting the information of telling you where your plane is at, when you're on the airplane. And so this is kind of some of those things where a lot of people don't realize that they're using this data and that it's important for them. Of course, like I said to my husband, like, yeah, and you wouldn't be able to use Strava if you didn't have people like me. So it's just kind of one of those things where a lot of people are using the data but don't realize that they're using it. And so when I saw this and I kind of learned what OpenStreet mapping was at the conference, I was just like, this is, we talk about service learning, it's meaningful learning, it's engaging. It teaches students how to be empowered. It's a free resource. It doesn't cost any money. You don't have to have, there's a little bit of a learning curve to it, but it's free. And it evolves. Like, you don't have to do the same project over and over. You can find different projects. You can find projects that are happening today. It also makes your students kind of think about their community. they can start thinking about, well, what's going on in my community, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about local community projects. And kind of like, how do you solve these problems? You know, if a community is destroyed either through a hurricane or floods or a tornado or whatever, is our community ready for that? And then it helps spark that positive community change. You know, like, how can I do this? How can I help my community? And it also teaches them a tool that they can apply, that they can use after they leave your classroom, after they leave high school, which I'll talk a little bit about. They can continue to do this in high school. They can continue to do it in their profession. It could potentially lead to a huge internship. And so there's a lot of things that it could introduce your students to. And so I think the other thing too, that it's taking what you're teaching in the classroom and it's applying it to the real world. And I think that that's very important. And the other thing too is, I always like to say, you know, students are using the internet so much, social media, and I know we talk about digital footprint, and they're aware of it, but this is really important to have a really good digital footprint. You know, making good edits, being conscientious about what you're editing and labeling it correctly. And so it's kind of reinforcing kind of, you know, it's very important about what digital footprint you leave while you're doing OpenStreetMapping, because there's a lot of people checking your edits and checking what kind of work you're doing. And so that's kind of another thing to reinforce your students, and when we're talking about that 21st century skills, right? So I'm going to show you some examples. There are local mapping projects, and then you can do global mapping projects. If you do something that's global, obviously you're not familiar with the area. So usually when you do those kinds of projects, you're going to be mapping buildings and roads, keeping it very simple. And so when you map that building, like you saw in that other, you're just going to label it, it's a building. I don't know what kind of building. I don't know if it's a house. I don't know if it's a barn. I don't know if it's a school. I don't know, but I know it's a building. And then you draw a road. I think it's a road, but I don't know if it's a main road. I don't know if it's a driveway. I just know it's a road. And so you just kind of label things very general, you know, in very general terms. And this is really a good way. Like one time I had my students map in Peru, and it was really interesting because the area that we were mapping, the houses were round. And so we had this huge conversations like, why would they make up round houses? What do they look like? And, you know, so the students start pulling it up. Oh, this is where we're at. This is what a house looks like, you know. And so it was really kind of neat because the kids got it, you know, were really interested. And they're like, well, this gives me a better idea if I'm mapping this correctly. And it was just kind of neat to hear those conversations. You can also do local mapping projects in your own community or a community that you're familiar with. And when you do that, you can still map buildings, you can still map roads. Oftentimes my students will say, well, all of Mashpee's mapped, Mrs. Reynolds. Well, this is where we kind of went back in, and I'm like, yeah. So a lot of things have been mapped, but maybe not all the buildings have been labeled. So we call this metadata, where does the school have the address, phone number, and website where people can learn more about Mashpee High School? Did they update, you know, that store that used to be next to Starbucks? It's now something else. Did they update that? And so the students can go in and kind of look around and say, no, they haven't, but I can put in the correct name. And so that's kind of neat. This is a great article called Resilience Mapping. And this is another thing where you can have your students look at their community, and they can kind of, they have a, you can kind of go into OpenStreetMapping and say, is our community resilient for a natural disaster? Is it set up? And it has students start to look to see, is it mapped? Do you have these sort of things mapped? You know, are there, you know, medical facilities? Is there, you know, all these different things of when you're talking about is a community ready for a natural disaster? And it's really kind of neat to kind of think about that. And you can do this in OpenStreetMap and have your students do it. So some things that I have done in my classroom is refugees. We talk about people migrating from one place to another, and I love using the Choices program, and because it uses stories and it talks about movement and it talks about why different refugees go here or they go there, and why some take their family and some don't go with their family. And so I have my students do that, and my students said, well, Mrs. Reynolds, we'd like to help the refugees. What can we do? And this is kind of when I said, oh, well, we could do some OpenStreet mapping, and we can look for some Syrian refugee camps that need some mapping. And that's exactly what we did. And I took there is a learning curve for my students to learn it, but once they learned it, they were like, when are we doing that again? And so I kind of carved out time and days that, I turned on some music. We had this was a day that right before our winter break, and the students, and I called it the gift of the map, and kind of saying, today you're giving your time and of mapping this place to help others. And so that's what we did. And here's another example of kind of what we did another time that we were doing mapping in the classroom. So when I teach human geography, I'm originally from Illinois. And so one of the things that I'll do is I use my hometown, Mount Pulaski, because it's so different from where I'm from. And I have my students map in Mount Pulaski. And so they know a lot about Mount Pulaski. And so this is done in rural America, because I try to tell them, here is my hometown, and it was not mapped, And so a lot of people think, oh, missing maps in other countries. Well, there are a lot of communities in the United States that are not mapped, and my hometown is one of them. And they're like, oh, wow. And what does that mean? And we talk about food deserts. We talk about food deserts in urban spaces, but we also talk about food deserts in the United States. And so this is just kind of a local mapping project that they kind of contributed to. This is another example kind of showing you, this is in Santa Rosa, California, the wildfires that took off I think it was 2 falls ago, right? Was that last fall? Was that last fall? I'm losing track of time with COVID. And so the Red Cross and FEMA needed these areas mapped immediately, updated in real time, because the fires were spreading very quickly. So my students, I had them like, hey guys, today we're going to do some OpenStreet mapping, and we're going to help FEMA, we're going to help Red Cross. They need this data because the fires are going very quickly, and they needed to kind of know like how much support and how much supplies that they needed to send to that area, and how many people were being displaced because of the fires. Another local mapping project that we did last year during COVID was, how information was changing constantly with where can I get a test? Where can I get vaccinated? Where can I get this medicine? Where can I, who has this? When are they open? Do I have to make an appointment? I mean, I don't know if you guys were navigating through that, and I'm sure you were, like we were down here, and it seemed like it was changing on a daily basis. There was a site called Health Sites, and I had my students go on, and we started mapping all the CVS's, any pharmacies that were found in Stop and Shops, or any grocery stores, any medical walk-in clinics. And so what they were doing is they were looking for this information, finding the websites and putting that metadata in there and saying, hey, this is a pharmacy, or hey, you can get vaccinated here, or hey, they're doing a COVID test here, and these are the hours that you can do, no appointment needed or appointment. And so this was trying to kind of do real time of where people can access medical services during the time of COVID, which was really cool and really neat. And so as we think about this, and I'm getting to kind of where I'm, a lot of teachers say, well, I had a student in my freshman class that turned around and said, I really loved doing this. And it's kind of interesting because I just had a conversation with her on Friday. Her senior year, she ended up making a community mapathon, which she brought people from the community that came in. And she had my human geography students who were in 9th grade try to help the older people learn what to do. And she picked a project, and then she's really into the arts. And so she had artists make a sculpture, create a poem, write a song. She had dancers dance to a song that had something to do with the topic that we were mapping. And so she made it a very entertaining night, bringing art into it, but also showing how we can come together and help others. And funny thing, she is at Columbia University now, and she's a senior, and she's applying for graduate school. And it's very funny. She says, Mrs. Reynolds, I'm in this ArcGIS class, and she's a theater major, so she's not a geography major at all. And she says, and I'm applying for this fellowship, and I'm really liking this GIS, but I want to apply it to my theater. And I said, oh, and she's like, so I was thinking about doing this. And I said, what about taking it one step further and adding OpenStreet mapping? And she says, oh, I never thought about that. That's excellent. And so here you have a student who is in something completely different, not geography, but is looking at the sustainability of theaters and where they service communities. And so she is going to be working on a project in New Zealand for her graduate work on this fellowship, which I think is just fascinating. And she says that probably the reason I'm gonna, she's excited. I'm gonna get this is because of the OpenStreet mapping. So it's something that it's a tool that they can carry on with them as they leave your classroom. And so I always say it's, introducing your students to the OSM community. It's getting them actively engaged in creating a map instead of just consuming a map, because that's usually all they're doing most of the time, and kind of why and how they're using this OpenStreet mapping, and try to find out how they can help others and apply real world application to solving world problems. And so there is a workflow, you give them background information, you look for projects, you have the students map, and then usually your edits will update within 20 minutes if you're kind of wondering when you can see. And then you can go into OpenStreetMap and see what the students have contributed, which is pretty neat. And so I think it's always really important to explain to students, like, how does this process work? Who's making these projects? Students want to know what they're doing. Who are we helping today? Why are we helping them, And so I think once you sell them the why and how and where they fit into this puzzle, you're a contributor, you're a mapping volunteer, and this is really important, and your contributions are important. And so students just kind of, they're active, they're producing maps, it makes them to start to critically think. It gets them to kind of be introduced to how people are using OpenStreet mapping. And it also allows them to kind of work on their spatial citizenship and work on service learning in not just their own community, but also the world. And they have fun. They actually have fun, so much fun that during COVID, a lot of my students, if we were on a hybrid a hybrid schedule, so they were in for a week and out a week, but we were all on our computers, basically. Students were looking for ways to be able to give back because, volunteering or anything like that was kind of cut out. So a lot of my students that I had my 9th grade year came back to me and they said, Mrs. Reynolds, remember when we were doing that OpenStreet mapping? And I'm like, yeah, like, we could do that. Like, we would want to do that because we want to give back, and we can't do all these things in our community, but maybe we can give back in this way. So could you kind of create a format where we have a place where we could do OpenStreet mapping together? And that's kind of what kind of branched out. It was my National History Honor Society and my Human Rights Club. And I co-advise the Human Rights Club, and they're kind of the same students. And they said, we'd like to do this. Could you do it? So they came up with the name Team Maptivists. They did this. I didn't. They found an art student to create the logo. So this is the current logo at the time. And we call them map-alongs. And we started them last spring, where students, we have a guest mapper come in, and we had the geographer of the United States, Dr. Lee Schwartz, who works at the State Department, talk about, how important OpenStreet mapping is to his line of work and why these maps are important for him as the geographer of the United States. We also had Erica Hagen. If you're not familiar with her, she does incredible work. She started the company called Map Kibera with her husband. That's an area in Kibera where it was not mapped. There was 250,000 people, and they went in there and they helped their community map it. And then we also had Courtney Clark, which she works for Youth Mappers and USAID. She also works for American Geographical Society, and she works on getting more women to map. Because when we talk about like who's mapping, we want a variety of people. We want, especially the marginalized groups, which usually tend to be women, younger people, and minorities. And so trying to get them to be mapping, so their voice is being heard in the map. We had another young woman, Adele from USAID, who works in the Geo Center, talking about her journey in college and how she was involved in youth mappers and how she is now using OpenStreetMap in her role at the USAID. And then we have youth mappers, which are college students. Youth mappers is kind of the high college level of team activists. And they come in and they help us. Sometimes they're the guest speakers talking about what they're majoring in, why they're doing youth mappers, what projects they're mapping, and kind of talk to the high school students. So like, hey, you should check out if the colleges that you're looking at are you have a youth mapper group. And they talk about like the youth mapper from Texas Tech was talking about he was working on mapping local parks and why that was important for their community, and what was he looking at. And so we were actually mapping parks, which was kind of interesting when we were thinking about it. So it's kind of starting to also educate students. This is a chance for students to kind of see who's out there who's using it, why they're using it, why it's important in their line of work, and kind of career opportunities, as also thinking about that they can major in geography and that there is work for them to do. And how, like, for example, the young woman from George Washington had an internship. She did a virtual internship using OpenStreetMapping with USAID. And so, you have these amazing opportunities where you can be doing some incredible work at these very, fascinating agents, government agencies or NGOs as you were in college. And, you can learn that base, those skills in high school and then build on them. So when you get into college, you could do an internship with some of these amazing people. And so we started off with a map along with another school in Texas. And our biggest, we had over, this one was our first one, but our second one, we ended up having over 100 students from all over, and 11 states, and actually a couple from Canada, which was really exciting. Students coming in saying, hey, I'm kind of interested in this. And what we're finding is teachers get a little nervous because they're like, okay, I introduced this technology. I don't know a lot about it. And I don't know if I'm comfortable enough teaching it to my students. What if they ask me a question and I don't know how to answer it? And I'm totally with you right there. It's like I have to be at least one step ahead of my students. And so this is a great way of like, okay, I want to start integrating it into my classroom. I'm not sure how, but I can introduce it to my students. They can go, I can send them there. They can get community service or service learning hours, however you how you categorize it in your school. They can kind of get an idea of what it's about, meet these guest mappers, bring their friends, and then work with a teacher that might want to start a chapter. And that's what we're hoping, that we can start different chapters at different schools all across the nation. And kind of taking the heavy load off of the teacher, so the teacher having to introduce it to the classroom, taking up time, setting up accounts and things like this. Maybe we can have kind of the student initiative as well, kind of trying to figure out ways that they can give back to different communities. And so this is kind of what we've been working on. We have monthly map-alongs, and that's where we have guest mappers. We're having map-a-thons. Actually, we're going to have a map-a-thon in November with the American Geographical Society. So if a teacher and the AGS has been really nice. They're very excited for teachers to start it. So if they want to have have students mapping, and they want to do it in the school on the Saturday, because we are going to have it on a Saturday, they're willing to give you grant money. to pay for pizza, to pay for soda, to pay for ice cream, whatever you want to, candy, whatever you want to serve. They're like, hey, we're just trying to get teachers to introduce this to their students. They're also happy to give you another, grants to, if you can't make that one and you want to do it another time. We're trying to build up with youth mappers to be a youth mapper to mentor different high school chapters. So if a student had a question like, hey, I want to make a community mapathon, could you help me? Going, yeah, we can help you with that. And they can help them during the mapathon. So, these are a lot of things like, how do I do that? I've never done this before. And so as you're going through that learning process, providing that mentorship that will help guide you through those processes. And so, and eventually we hope, 5-10 years down the road, we can create internships for our high school students that have become advanced mappers. Because it's measured by how many edits you make and how good of edits you make. And that's all done through OpenStreetMapping. You don't have to do anything. And so it will say, oh, you're an advanced mapper. So we're hoping to build this program up and get it going and give an opportunity for our students. I don't know if you want me to show this to you or not. I think we're doing okay on time. But this is a quick, this is a talk, and the reason I'm only showing it, some of it's repetitive information, but I do want to show you, I'm working with one of the senior students at my school who was one of my, and I just want you to hear her voice and kind of hear kind of the benefits of it. And it's also talking about making sure everybody is mapping and seeing, the making the maps more equitable. And so I just kind of want to show this to you. No one has ever seen this, so you guys are the first here.
Maps give us a lot of information about a place.
Can you hear?
Living there. In the past 20 years, there's been a surge of participatory mapping initiatives around the world, and one of them is OpenStreetMap. Several years ago, I was attending the AGS conference as a teacher fellow where I learned about OpenStreetMap. As I learned more about how OSM mapping projects could be used to solve real-world problems while developing my students' skills where they can apply content learned in the classroom to helping others, I knew I had to introduce my students to the world of OSM.
Fortunately, I was one of the students who learned about OSM in the AP Human Geography classroom when we were learning about refugees in Syria. After learning about the difficult life refugees face in camps, Mrs. Reynolds showed us how OSM could help the refugees, and we began to map the next day in class. We continued to do mapping projects like that all year, as well as other mapping projects, such as a mapathon, and it was really cool how what we were learning in class, we were able to do mapping that would help improve the lives of the people we were learning about, like the Syrian refugees. We students saw the benefits of participatory mapping and making a positive impact using OSM. During my sophomore and junior year, the pandemic prevented me, as well as my classmates, from participating in any service learning. This is when we remembered doing mapping in our AP Human Geography class during our freshman year, and how we were able to help others from our computers. We asked Mrs. Reynolds to help us organize regular mapathons where we could map together. Our school partnered with another school in Mesquite, Texas, and we began to Zoom with each other mapping projects that needed volunteer mappers. This launched a new initiative called OSM Teen Maptivists, a student organization for high school students to learn about OSM and how they can help others through mapping.
Each month, Teen Maptivists host map-alongs or mapathons for high school students to join. Map-alongs provide students an opportunity to hear from professionals who use OSM in their line of work and begin to understand how OSM helps others. In addition, students are shown how to sign up for an account and given basic instructions on how to map.
OSM allows students to see the inequities of the world through missing data and how vulnerable people are if their community is not mapped. Maps tell people where things are located, rivers, mountains, deserts, as well as where people live. However, when things are not mapped, then we are not informed about the people or the land in this area. What I learned the most is that when people are not mapped, they become susceptible to natural disasters, war, disease, and hunger. If others do not know there are people living in a location, they cannot be included in decisions that might help protect them or provide them with resources that could help them survive. So mapping is important because those who are not mapped are defenseless and at an automatic disadvantage.
Participatory mapping is a starting point to include everyone in important decisions that impact their community. However, we also want all students to have access to participate to help others in their community. Introducing high school students to mapping in OSM allows them to see how they can be included in the mapping process, which ultimately reveals their voices in the map.
If all students can participate in a local community mapping project, they can help influence what is seen on the map and influence decisions made in that region. Having a diverse group of individuals from a community, such as women, youth, and impoverished individuals who tend to be excluded from the mapping process, helps to make maps that represent everyone. Building an inclusive community of mappers, as well as those who need their communities mapped, is a goal to help build stronger communities.
After 5 map-alongs, Teen Maptivists has had over 100 mappers and educators from 11 different states in Canada. Teen Maptivists' goals is to encourage more students to get involved and start a chapter at their high school. This year, the American Geographical Society is offering GeoBoost grants to encourage students and teachers to start a chapter at their school.
We want to create a strong network of high school mappers who believe that in a click of a button, they can make a positive change in the world for all global citizens. If you are a teacher or student, please visit our website and join us for our next event. And for all the geography professionals out there, we would love for you to join us as a guest mapper at one of our events. Teen Maptivists hope to build better and stronger communities that are inclusive and equitable for all, because we are all in this together.
So that's kind of the kind of where and how you can include it. So if you are thinking about, oh, I would love to include OpenStreetMapping in my classroom, but I'm not sure how, or don't feel comfortable how. OpenStreetMapping, like the Teen Maptivist, is a way for you to send your students. You can come too, teachers can come too. We don't say, oh no, but it's just a way to put your toe in the water. I like to say, like, kind of feel the water and kind of take the burden off of you of having to be an expert in something. And it could be something that you're learning with your students side by side. It could be a way of giving them extra credit, service learning hours, but maybe, creating an organization or an opportunity for them to learn more about OSM. I just want to stop. Does anybody have any questions so far?
I mean, this is, wow, incredible. First a comment, like I think what's really standing out to me is the student agency aspect of this, that it's not just a tool to teach, but it's a tool for students to actually like apply, and it's authentic. And I think that's so fantastic. And I'm also really impressed with like the community building aspect of it, that connecting students to other folks. And so I know that there's a ton going on, but like, what's that concrete first step for a teacher who's like, I love this idea, I don't know what to do next?
So that's exactly, and I think it's kind of you as a teacher have to decide kind of how you want to introduce it. I think, myself, I always have goals for myself. We all have goals, but I always say I like to try to integrate something new every year in my classroom, and I push myself. And, the first year I did this, it was, okay, I first have to set up an account, which I'm going to show you. And then I attended at least 2 mapathons, or we call them map-alongs, with the TeachOSM to get myself familiar with it.
Cool.
And then I decided, figured out where I could do it. And I said, I'm going to do one mapping project this year. That was my goal in class. And it was more about exposing my students to it. It wasn't more of, I'm going to make them these, incredible advanced mappers. I kind of had to decide. It was just exposing them to it. And so that first year, I actually ended up doing 2 projects. And because my students enjoyed it. So they were like, we want to do more. So we did one and they enjoyed it. We did it again. And then in the end of the year, we did it again at the end of the year as well. So it was like, okay, I'm going to do one. And then once my students, I got over that learning curve, because I think there's a learning curve to it. That's kind of where, I was going to take you next was, you first need to get, you need to get familiar with OpenStreetMapping. So you need to create your account. And so you would go into OpenStreetMap.org. And once you do that, it'll take you in and you can go into there, and then you want to log in. And this is kind of where when you're working with students, you want them to use a personal email account, because they're going to continue, hopefully they're going to continue to use this after they leave the school. So you don't want their OpenStreetMapping account to be connected to their school account if it's going to expire. And that's another way of you kind of talking about, digital footprint. This is going to be something that you could possibly be doing when you're 45 years old, and they'll be like, oh, wow, that's old, and I'm like, hey, watch it there, right? So I think that's kind of important. And then when you go on there, there's an ID editor walkthrough, and it automatically puts you into the walkthrough. And so it walks you through on how to make those edits. And then you can start editing. And I think that's where the teachers get scared. Oh, what if my students make bad edits? How do I see that? And the thing is that there are people monitoring edits all the time. And if they see that there was an edit and it wasn't the best, they'll delete it. And so that's kind of one of the things. And that's where, it's really important to kind of reiterate to your students about being, like making really good edits and not being silly and funny and putting silly names and silly, addresses or anything like that in there. And so you can log into TeachOSM Tasking Manager and start looking for different tasks. And there's different places to look for projects. Like you can look in TeachOSM, which is more educational, and they house a lot more educational ones there. If you are interested, eventually, as you get more comfortable with OpenStreetMapping, you can also reach out to the TeachOSM team, and they would be more than happy to help teachers create their own projects. Like I created several of my own projects after I got my feet wet and after I started kind of figuring out how I wanted to incorporate this with my students. And then you choose a task in Square and you start mapping. So kind of some of the, I don't know why this is not moving. There it is. You can go to openstreetmap.org. And so if you go up there, you'll see this right here, and it's like sign up. And you sign up and you create your account. And then you have to you'll get an email and you'll have to verify that. So you can create your username, which is really important to think about what your username, and that's once again, when you talk to your students, like make sure this is a name that's going to go with you for a very long time. So let's make it really a nice name. And a lot of people say don't use your email address, username, try to stay away from that and try not to have spaces in your new username. And so that's kind of how you get started. And then, like I was saying, there is an ID editor walkthrough, which just kind of shows you kind of how to make a building, and you can you can draw a building, or how to draw a road, and kind of show you how to navigate through the OpenStreetMapping platform. And that's one of the things, and those usually take 10 to 15 minutes to do. And I usually have my students, if they're in the classroom with me, and they're still new to it, I have them do that right before we start doing real-time mapping. I have them do the walkthrough. Say, okay, log into your OpenStreetMapping accounts. All right, now you have 15 minutes to complete the walkthrough. And yeah, we already did that. I know you already did it, but I want you to be, it's a friendly reminder. We all could be doing it. It's really important to kind of think about how we're mapping and how to map, and kind of revisit those things, because it's been about a month or two, or sometimes 3 months since the last time we did some mapping, just to refresh those skills. And so, you get into your projects, and you get a pink square, and so students will get their own square, so they're not mapping on top of one another. And then they trace and they start tagging their edits. And then you can also, this is really cool, you could create a hashtag for your class. So I always, do a hashtag where it's hashtag Mashpee Falcons, and then I have the year they graduate. So I know what class did those edits, and you can check. You can check if they use those hashtags, how many edits that class made in OpenStreetMapping. And so you can kind of keep track of, like, if that's important to you, how many edits that they made, to show kind of progress. Like, look how many communities we helped. The Mashpee Falcons have made 50,000 edits. And it kind of is like, yeah, it's a great way of boosting that excitement of making edits. And so you create your OpenStreetMapping account in OSM, OpenStreetMap.org. But in order for you to start mapping in projects, you kind of have to go to tasking managers. And that's where I was explaining to you. You have to go into TeachOSM.org. You can go into HOT, which is humanitarian mapping, or you can go into missing maps. There's different places that host projects. That's what I'm trying to explain to you. And so you log in, and they say grant access to your OpenStreetMapping account, and then you look at different projects. And so this is kind of where you say, I want to start mapping. And this is kind of showing you kind of what that's going to look like. This is kind of showing you these are different projects. And so here you can search for a project number if you have a project number. Like, for example, I'll start looking for projects. And when I'm looking for projects, I'm usually looking for beginning mappers. I'm usually looking for building only, especially with students that are just beginning. I might be looking for a certain location. Like, for example, when I was looking for the refugees, I was looking for Syrian refugees, and you can find that kind of information, and you can no, I only want beginning mappers. So you can kind of start going through here, and then you have to read the instructions. And so there is a little bit of a learning curve, but in those instructions, they're saying, we only want you to map buildings, or you can map roads too. And that's kind of important to pay, make sure your students are reading those instructions and paying attention to it. This over here on the left is kind of showing you, once a student says, okay, I'm ready to map, and they hit contribute map, it gives them a pink box, and they're to map inside the pink box. And so if I say you're only allowed to map within that pink box, and you're only to map buildings, they're to go around into that, within that pink box, only mapping buildings and labeling them as buildings. And so that's kind of, the process of all of this and how that works. You have to make sure that you tell your students that each building has to be, especially when you get into really dense populations, and we were doing some mapping in Detroit, and it was like house after house, and they were all like the same rectangle. And it was overwhelming, because you're just like, okay, I just did 200 buildings, and I didn't even make a dent in my box. And then sometimes you do too. Like today I was doing some mapping, and I did 4 buildings, and my box was done because there was only four houses. So, but you want to make sure that your students don't get overwhelmed. And they just like, oh, I'm just going to make a big box and put all of those buildings together. You don't want to do that. Every building needs to have their own box. And so that's kind of things that you have to kind of be aware of with your students. And you want to try to be as accurate as possible. Sometimes students don't carve out the buildings. Like, this is a good building that they've carved it out correctly. It's okay if it shifts a little bit. Sometimes when you go into the mapping project, the satellite imagery, there's several different imageries that you can choose from, and oftentimes it'll tell you, please map in, this in this imagery, like Bing or something. So, and sometimes you can't, because there'll be a cloud, you can't see. You're like, I can't map in Bing, because in Bing, in my box, there's a cloud and I can't see the buildings. So I have to go to a different imagery, and you can tell them that. You can tell the validators. I could not map in Bing using the Bing satellite because there was a cloud when I did. So I had to use a different satellite imagery. So, the little things like that, but you learn that, and it doesn't, and it actually becomes pretty easy. And then you save your changes. One of the things that when you go to save, you can have somebody check your edits. I still do. I'm an advanced mapper, and I still have people check my edits, just because sometimes, I make mistakes, and I didn't see something as clear as I probably should have, or with as good an eye as maybe somebody else has. And once you're done, you put in a comment if you think that you're done with your box, or if you're just done, you just say, was not able to complete the box. And if there was anything else that you saw that you want to let the validators know, and you hit I'm done mapping, and it releases that box so that if somebody else comes into the project, you can map it. And so that's kind of how to do it. I could have you map, but I feel like sometimes that becomes overbearing. I wanted to focus more on kind of why you would want to do it, why it's beneficial, kind of show you some examples, talk about how if you want to introduce it to your students but not do it in the classroom, how that's an option. And I also want to just mention too, TeachOSM has map-alongs. They have them on Tuesday evenings for teachers, and you can go there, and Stephen Johnson from George Washington University is always there, and he is always happy to help. And then you also can have your students or you join Team Maptivists on Monday nights. It's once a month. So it's just, you just carve out some time, and you can join as well, or send some students. And other additional resources, TeachOSM has a website. They also have modules to help you, show you how to get your students set up. They break those things down for you, like everything that I was talking about, they break it down for you. They have map-alongs that you can attend for free. They're free, everything's free. And they always, I'm going to tell you, they are amazing people that are so eager to help teachers, and do whatever they can to help introduce it. And they're up for any projects. American Geographical Society is on board, and they will support you if you need money, if you think you need money. They have GeoBoost. They're giving away grants, though, up to $500, $200, $500 for teachers who are wanting to do this and feel like they need to, encourage, do you need an incentive like pizzas or whatever? If you're having it after school, they're willing to help teachers, support them. And then there's Team Maptivists as well. And so I just wanted to, that's kind of all how I focus. I'm wrapping up on an hour here, and I threw a lot of information at you, but it's something for you to kind of ideas and thoughts. And I know when I first learned about it, I had to kind of let it marinate a little bit. I always call it letting my brain marinate, kind of how I'm going to use it, and what the tool is, how I can use it, and when I could use it, and then begin the process of diving in and learning how to use the tool. And there is a little bit of a learning curve, but it's not huge. I mean, I think Power School sometimes is more difficult than OpenStreetMap, and so, because I'm like, where did that go? Like, I always have to pull out my manual every fall. Like, how do I set up my classes again? So I think that's kind of one of the things, but the more you use it, the easier it gets. And that's the other, strategy of these like map-alongs that TeachOSM offers, is the more that you attend those, like whether it's, okay, my goal is to attend 2 in the fall, right, with TeachOSM, or try to get my students to go. The more you see it and the more you're exposed to it, the more comfortable you get with it. And it's not as difficult as you would think it would be. And so that's all I have. If you have any questions, please, even after this, you can email me, and you can reach out to the TeachOSM team. They're always happy to help teachers. So thank you for listening. And I hope you're inspired to at least try OpenStreetMapping in some capacity at your schools. Thank you.
Yes, Les, thank you so much. The passion and the possibilities are the two things that really pop in this presentation. And then, like, I'm so excited to get under the hood of this and play around with it. So I appreciate that. I am going to stop the recording.